This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City with a bit of a cold, to be honest. Readers of the newsletter know that energy is one of my main topic focal points, and there's no shortage, pardon the pun, of issues to discuss in this area. In early April, I posted an episode on the money needed for Vietnam's energy transition, while today's show focuses more on the policy side of this equation. Vietnam has been on something of an energy roller coaster over the last 5 years, going from renewable energy darling by building out massive solar and onshore wind capacity and pledging net zero emissions by 2050, to major electricity outages across northern provinces last year that caused over $1 billion in economic damage and ongoing concerns about reliance on coal. Just last week, Reuters reported that Foxconn, a major Apple supplier with factories in the north, was asked to voluntarily reduce power consumption at its facilities by 30% amid concerns that electricity shortages will strike again. EVN then denied this, but in recent months, government officials have repeatedly warned that demand might outstrip supply, especially in the heavily industrialized area between Hanoi and Haiphong, where there's less renewable energy available compared to sun-drenched southern provinces. Within this context, it's worth looking at the state of two overarching regulations that will be key in driving the development of Vietnam's energy infrastructure through 2030 and beyond. Today's guest is Giles Cooper, a partner at the international law firm Allens, based in Hanoi, who specializes in issues around energy policies and regulations. We discuss the pending decree on direct power purchase agreements and how this will impact major manufacturers, the dramatic change this will bring to Vietnam's electricity market, Power Development Plan 8's LNG and offshore wind targets, and where all of these issues may go over the next few years. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest suggestions, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Well, let's get to my conversation with Giles. Giles, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Sure. So we've talked a few times over the years on various energy issues, and I really appreciate your insight on LinkedIn as well. There's a lot of topics we could have talked about, but I wanted to start by focusing on DPPA, or Direct Purchase Power Agreement, which has been in the news a good bit recently, especially for focus on energy. But I wondered if we could start by just explaining broadly what exactly is a DPPA.
Yeah, sure. So at its most simplest form, a DPPA is simply the ability of a consumer to purchase renewable energy directly and to be able to essentially prove that it is purchasing renewable energy.
So they would be buying from like a solar farm instead of going through the national grid?
Yeah, exactly. So the way that the model has developed over time in Vietnam is that there are two sort of aspects to the DPPA that are proposed, or two sort of models that exist within the same program. And the first model is that there is what they call a physical DPPA, and that, as you might imagine, is where there is a direct wire linking the generation plant, so a solar or wind plant in particular, a direct wire from that generation facility to the consumer, and the consumer buys directly the power that is generated by that facility. So that's one aspect of it, and then there's another aspect as well, and it's called the virtual element to the DPPA, and it's virtual because there's not a direct link between, or a direct wire between, the generator and the consumer. Instead, the consumer stays connected to the grid in its normal way. It purchases electricity from its EVN retailer as normal, but it enters into something called a contract for difference with the generator, and that's just purely a contractual arrangement. The generator sells its electricity into the wholesale market, so it sells into the grid, sells to EVN, and that electricity, the actual electrons generated by that project could effectively go anywhere, but from at a contractual level between the generator and the consumer, they have an agreement where they sort of support the price of that renewable energy, and ultimately the generator will provide renewable energy certificates to the consumer to evidence the use of the renewable energy.
So DPPA as a policy has been around for some number of years. I'm sure you can tell us. I know it's gone through a lot of, iterations, and I mean, some listeners will surely be familiar with some of the delays with energy policy in recent years here. And I think you mentioned to me that you've been pretty involved in this kind of from the start. So could you kind of walk us through a bit how this policy, when it was maybe proposed, and then how it's kind of evolved through its iterations over the years?
Yeah, sure. So it certainly has been quite a journey. It really sort of first came up as a proposal probably in late 2018, early 2019. And I believe it was around June 2019 when the MIT held a sort of public conference or workshop on it for the first time. So we're coming up to the 5-year mark very soon when it was sort of first introduced publicly. Since then, there have been quite a few developments and changes in the way it looks and the way it functions. I think in total there's been something like 13 different iterations of the policy that have been sort of made public, and it has changed quite significantly over that time, as I mentioned. So, for example, until around early last year, every iteration of the draft had only the virtual model that I mentioned before. It did not enable the direct wire model, and it was only I think it was around April last year that the option to have the direct wire model came into the draft. So that there's been quite significant changes from a structural level. There's also been quite significant changes from a sort of legal regulatory perspective, in that it's had over the various iterations, it's been variously a Prime Minister decision, an MOIT circular, a government decree, a government resolution, and finally we sort of come nearly full circle back to the government decree model, and it's looking very likely that it will be issued as a government decree ultimately. So yeah, quite a lot of change. Those are just a couple of the points. And another major one, for example, is that it had always been conceived initially as a pilot program. So there was going to be sort of a cap on the participants of it, and that cap was always sort of stated to be around a 1 gigawatt cap, and it was going to be assessed as to whether it was an appropriate market tool, whether it was popular, whether there should be changes to be made to it for sort of general release, so to speak. That's another example of something that's fallen by the wayside, and the current iteration of the regulation is that it will be immediately open fully and effectively without a limit, so no longer a pilot project. So quite significant changes throughout the years, and my involvement was quite a few years ago, but it was to support the VLEAP team, who were sort of spearheading the development of the program via the USAID, and it was just support them on analysis of the existing regulatory environment, the legislative gaps that existed that needed to be bridged in order to get a policy like this going. Because you have to really, and I think listeners really have to understand just how dramatic a change something like the DPPA is. On the one hand, it's relatively simple. A consumer is able to buy renewable energy. That sounds great. It sounds easy. But fundamentally, it's a very, very dramatic shift in the way the market functions. As probably many of your listeners know, Vietnam has essentially a state-integrated monopoly in transmission and sale of power. So there are some minor exceptions to that, and small rooftop projects have been one of those exceptions. Industrial zones, there are some other exceptions, but typically and generally, all electricity users around the country have to purchase from EVN, and they will transmit all the electricity as well. So it really is a very dramatic market shift to allow the private sector to participate in the transmission, but also the sale of large amounts of renewable energy. And that's a key reason why it's taken so long, because it's been very complicated to integrate it into the regulatory environment, and in particular against the backdrop of all the developments and changes that have been happening in the energy market over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and kind of on that market note, I'm not sure if this is related to DPPA or not, but a few articles recently about, so you've mentioned MOIT, that's Ministry of Industry and Trade, for those that might not know the acronym, but they're proposing, I think that kind of rooftop solar can be, I guess, sold, putting that in air quotes, to the grid, but for zero dong. Is that related to DPPA, or is that a separate issue?
It is related, and it's only really sort of come into focus recently in a way because, to date, a rooftop project has had to be very small scale. So any one rooftop project has to be 1 megawatt or less, which is, relatively small scale. And the DPPA was always aimed at large energy users. Once upon a time, there was a clause in the DPPA draft that, the consumers had to acquire at least 80% of their energy, using the DPPA regime. That is no longer present in the current draft, but what it would have meant is that rooftop solar would not have been adequate for a DPPA. And it also, in fact, one of the earlier drafts said that the minimum capacity of a participating generation plant would have to be 30 megawatts. That is also gone now. So it's liberalized dramatically over the various drafts. And now the latest iteration is that if you want to enter into a direct agreement with the direct wire, then there is no minimum amount of capacity involved. And, effectively what that means is that it opens the door for rooftop solar to participate in the DPPA regime, which is a very good move, very positive move. And it needs to be treated very separately than this big discussion about self-consumption and zero export, because that is effectively now in its own little box, where rooftop solar for self-consumption, zero export, is when you personally, as the energy user, invest in the system yourself. So it's self-investment, self-use, self-consumption of rooftop solar, which is now effectively only aimed at sort of residential users primarily, because when the DPPA is issued, as long as you're a large electricity user, you'll be able to have a direct wire rooftop solar project. Now, whether you want to have one or not is another question, because most of the participants in the DPPA will be very large energy users who need something bigger.
Speaking of the large energy users, I mean, over the years, I've seen, the likes of Samsung, for example, kind of say, like, we want this policy. We're waiting for it. So what kind of concretely, what would the benefits be to, Samsung or something along those lines, these major energy consumers?
I mean, there's a variety of different factors. There's sort of a number of push and pull factors. I mean, on the push front, a lot of these companies have made, global renewable energy commitments where they commit to use a certain amount, often up to 100% renewable energy by a certain date. And that date is often, for many of them, 2030. For some European companies, it's even earlier than that. So, their operations around the world, they've made commitments that they will use renewable energy by certain dates. So they essentially have obligated themselves to ensure that is possible. And of course, there's a range of various commitments and flex on that, perhaps amongst the different users. But fundamentally, they're obliged and they wish to meet those commitments. So that's a big push factor for them to get involved and to promote these schemes. Another one that is sort of a push factor is related to carbon costs and carbon taxes. The one most often talked about around here is the European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where, in a nutshell, if you are, if you're using, or if you're not able to show that your power sources are such that you're meeting the European regulations on the carbon use throughout your production chain, then you'll have to pay more to get your products distributed in the European market. And there are a number of other schemes like that around the world. So those sort of factors push companies to get involved with DPPA. But there are also pull factors as well, such as, for example, the cost and the reliability of the energy. On the cost point, most research shows and most commentators believe that ultimately you'll be able to pay less for electricity. You'll be able to enter into a fixed long-term contract with the generator where you can fix your costs. You'll have cost certainty for power over 15, 20 years, up to maybe even longer. Whereas, of course, if you're just purchasing from the grid, you don't have that cost certainty. Costs will fluctuate, and of course, they are going up here, and they probably need to go up quite a bit more just to meet market basics, let alone the future cost escalation that is likely. So that's a pull factor, but also the reliability of the power. I mean, as is widely reported, last year there were power disruptions in the north that affected manufacturers quite severely. They are forecast again this year, and who knows, maybe next year as well. So if you are able to do a deal with an offsite generator that you can pretty much assure a certain percentage of your power, then you have a lot of comfort on that as well. So there's a variety of factors, very commercial, but also social license related as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the northern power shortages, which is a really interesting issue. And I mean, a few days ago before we recorded this, I saw an article from Reuters saying that I think Foxconn factories had been asked to voluntarily reduce their power use by 30%, which is significant. And obviously there's a lot of concern. I mean, so logistically, if, or when DPPA passes, would renewable energy sources be being built, adjacent to factories essentially?
Well, that's the big question, really. The direct wire PPA has been pushed for by various sources for quite a long time, and it's great to have that option in there. But the reality is that for a lot of these large electricity users, it's not simple or possible to co-locate a generation plant that's large enough to really make a meaningful difference in the energy use. So that's where the virtual element becomes very, very valuable, because you can have a large, 160, 200 megawatt wind or solar plants in the south of the country, and you can be Samsung in the north of the country and have that contract for differences with them and participate in the DPPA that way. And that enables, first of all, you can diversify, so you could have a number of different contracts with different generators, perhaps covering different sort of times, or with you making use of different technologies and different amounts. And of course, you don't need to have the big space of land nearby to be able to physically run a wire, because, as you can imagine, it's quite complicated to run wires over long distances in Vietnam, unless perhaps you do have a plot of land inside an industrial zone, for example.
And so what, I know you mentioned right before we started recording that there was like a new draft today. We're recording this on the May 23rd. So I'm assuming you haven't had a chance to assess that latest decree draft, and I know forecasting the future of regulations here is kind of a fool's errand, but what's the timeline looking like for this now?
Yeah, good question. You're absolutely right. I've been here long enough to know that prognostication on regulatory timelines is indeed a fool's errand. But having said that, I am actually feeling very confident that we will see the DPPA regulation very, very soon. The fact that we've seen 3 drafts of it in the last month goes to show some of the urgency on the matter. It's become a really significant point. Nearly every new major foreign investor that comes to Vietnam will have the ability to procure renewable energy on the very top of their list for one of the factors to make the investment decision. So it's become a real imperative to get this done. And we've also seen very recently that Deputy Prime Minister Ha essentially approved for the MIT to use a fast track method to get this decree issued by the government. So the stars are sort of aligning on that. And while I am very reluctant to put any timeline on it, I would not be surprised if we see the final document in the next month.
And I mean, what would kind of the most immediate impact be once it is finalized and passed?
The most immediate impact will probably be that everyone needs to study very carefully how they can participate in this, and by that I mean, so for the really large projects and the virtual projects, first of all, you still need to comply with all the general planning on and approval and permitting of the facility. So future greenfield projects that are going to be designed to participate directly in this will have quite a long runway that they need to work through to ensure that they can actually implement the projects. So on the one hand, it'll be quite a slow process, I believe, to roll out the major projects. On the other hand, I think if indeed it is confirmed ultimately that rooftop solar projects will be able to participate, then we will see, I think, very rapid take-up of that element at least. As I say, it won't meet the needs of all the customers and the consumers immediately, but it will be an important step for them to take rapidly.
Yeah, I guess that's good advice generally when it comes to new regulations. Study it carefully. So I wanted to maybe pivot a little bit, obviously sticking within energy, but LNG or liquefied natural gas, which you've also had a lot of analysis about over the years, and we've spoken about before. I went back and found an article I wrote in 2021 where you and I talked about this, and at the time you said you thought Vietnam would be lucky to have 3 LNG plants selling energy to the grid by 2030. So just for a bit of context, LNG is, I think, a pretty important part of Power Development Plan 8. It's kind of pitched as like a transitional fuel as Vietnam and other countries move away from coal. Has your view changed on kind of the prospects of LNG here?
Slightly, not dramatically. You're absolutely right. I think 2021 was still a full 2 years before we got PDP-8, and in 2023 we got PDP-8. It planned that there'll be 22 gigawatts of LNG by 2030. That was spread across 13 projects in PDP-8. So the plan is that 13 projects will get connected by 2030. Of course, a plan is just something that you deviate from overall, and there won't be 13 connected by 2030. I feel pretty confident saying that. But I can also say that there's definitely where we're seeing the most movement and activity at the moment. So there is clearly an impetus and a push from the government to move those projects forward, and in particular to establish the commercial frameworks on which those projects can get financed and built. So it's again very hard to say, but maybe 4, maybe 4 or 5 by 2030, because that they will run in parallel once these commercial terms have been established.
Okay. And are there any currently running?
No, there are none running at the moment. The most advanced one are Nonchak 3 and 4, which are state-owned. They're owned by the PVN, and they are under construction. There's one other one that's under construction as well, which is also a domestic invested one. Most, if not all, of the rest of them have foreign participation planned or already committed. And so they're at earlier stages. They're still in the early development stages, those ones.
I mean, I know over the years I've seen some, I guess, fairly high profile like U.S. investors. I mean, the U.S., of course, is a huge producer of LNG. Is that where a lot of the big foreign investment would come from, or is it a mix?
I think it's a real mix. If you look at of those 13 odd projects that are due to be connected this decade, I think 11 or 12 of them have investors selected already. As I say, a couple of them are fully state or domestic investors at the moment. Of the remaining sort of 9 or so, 10, they are quite a broad mix, including Americans, Europeans, Japanese, Korean investors, and some others as well. So it's pretty well spread out. It's really reflective of the way Vietnam really does seem to approach various strategic industries and really sort of diversify its inputs, which I think is smart.
And I mean, are those envisioned to replace coal that would be phased out, or is that in addition to coal?
Yeah, I think everyone wishes it was that simple, but Vietnam's transition story is really about the growth and demand and the new capacity that needs to be built. It's PDP-8 forecasts that the total overall capacity will be doubled between 2023 or 2022 and 2030. So we need a lot of new capacity, and it's unfortunately not as simple as putting an LNG on and turning a coal off, because the demand for the extra power is there. So while it's not as simple as that, the short answer is yes. That is part of the plan to move away from coal as a baseline to use LNG as a baseline power source, and of course to further prioritize the rollout of renewable energy and longer term, very important renewable energy that will displace coal and LNG even further, like hydrogen, ammonia, and offshore wind.
I mean, you mentioned the transition, which I mean, every country is trying to go through this. It's a very difficult, expensive process. Where do you think Vietnam kind of stands in that, in the context of these? You know, we've got these looming shortages in the north. They were quite serious last year. I mean, we'll see in the coming weeks how this year goes. You know, I've seen articles about how coal imports are way up. I think coal plants have been, asked to hold off on maintenance so that they can keep running at full speed. What impact are these like capacity or these generation issues having on kind of the shift towards more renewables?
Yeah, it's been a very complicated few years for sure, and there's no doubt that confluence of factors, including global energy supply and costs, the slow development of the regulatory framework here post feed-in tariffs for renewable energy. There's no doubt that these factors have, I think, adversely affected the speed at which a transition can happen. But having said that, that doesn't mean that all the complex and costly issues in the transition would have been able to flourish if those factors didn't exist. So it's a very complicated sort of assessment. But overall, I think Vietnam is, if you take a very big picture look and you do consider the complexity which are faced by many countries around the world, then I think they're on the right path. They're going in the right direction. My gut feeling is that perhaps things won't be as positive as forecast in PDP8 in terms of the overall renewable energy mix. But of course, security of supply and availability and affordability of supply remain very, very high priorities as well. And it's something the government has always done very, very well, and EVN has always done very, very well over many years. So there are a lot of positives, but one has to suspect that they might not reach quite the targets that are planned in PDP8, given the short amount of time we have left now to implement them and some of the challenges that exist.
Yeah, it is going to come up fast. And I guess one energy source we haven't mentioned, I'm not sure if it's one of your focal points, but it's offshore wind, which is, I believe, also a fairly substantial part of PDP8 and certainly the future, but none has been built or is being built currently. Or would you be able to speak on that for a minute?
Yeah, it's a topic very close to my heart. In fact,
okay.
We're very excited about the opportunity for offshore wind here, as are quite a number of very sophisticated and experienced investors. The resource, of course, is second to none in ASEAN region, so the opportunity is huge. The parties who have the experience are very engaged and keen. The plan, it was pretty ambitious in terms of PDP8, that the PDP8 said there would be 6 gigawatts of offshore wind connected by 2030. There's currently 0 at the moment, and there are quite a few steps that need to be concluded and agreed before those projects can really commence in earnest. So it's going to be extraordinarily challenging to meet that 6 gigawatt target, and I don't think many people believe that can be done. But again, to my earlier point, it will get done. Certainly, we will have a very significant amount of offshore wind here in the future. It's just unfortunately been a bit of a stuttering start, again, mainly because of the delays in the regulatory environment for offshore wind. But we, like LNG, we are seeing movement finally happening there. And the MIT recently issued its proposal to the government for how the sort of early rollout of offshore wind should begin. So that's still in draft, but it's a very positive development. And I think most of the majors are still committed to the long-term big picture there.
So I guess looking at at the immediate future. So I mean, we've talked about DPPA hopefully coming soon. Of course, on the other side, an issue is to watch these potential power shortages in the north. Are there any other major issues kind of potentially coming to a head in the next few months or year that you're keeping an eye on?
Yeah, so probably the biggest one is the mechanism under which investors will be selected to implement projects. So in the past, under the feed-in tariff regime, there was a relatively chaotic rollout of the way projects were identified, investors were selected, and that they were built and connected, and that's well known. There's been an investigation by the government into the way that happened, and lessons have been learned. And so now we have PDP-8, we have clear plans. So just for example, there's 17 gigawatt of onshore wind that will be developed according to the plan between now and 2030. That is at once both a very ambitious target, but also a doable target. Onshore wind is, of course, relatively less costly and easy to implement than offshore wind. But the big question that and now we have various important regulations to enable that. So we understand how the pricing framework is going to work. We're getting close to understanding what the PPA terms will be for those projects. But what we don't have yet is a mechanism for how the specific investors will be selected to run those projects. So that has now devolved effectively to provincial level, and each of the provinces is in charge of developing their plans to implement PDP-8. And by that, they need to identify, PDP-8 says, okay, Ningtwat, you have, 5 gigawatt of wind in your province to 2030. It's up to the province to identify, that is X number of projects located in X number of places, which will be scheduled to connect to the grid at these sort of times. And that's the process that they've nearly completed doing now. But again, we don't know exactly what mechanism we use to say, okay, you are the party that is going to go forward and implement this project. There was a lot of discussion about using an auction-based regime to select investors, and that certainly hasn't gone away, but it also hasn't been developed significantly since it's been floated, and I don't think we've seen a draft of that regulation for well over a year now. And so the question is, will that be used in the very immediate future? And if so, what will it look like? Because that's going to delay things, or will there be some other mechanism used in the short term to select investors? So that's probably the biggest topic that I and our clients are looking at.
And then one actually probably final question. I know nuclear is getting discussed a lot internationally these days, both pro and con. I know Vietnam in years past had considered it and then kind of tabled it because it is hugely expensive. I know it's not in PDP-8 or anything like that. Is there any talk that you hear of maybe reconsidering nuclear at some point?
The answer is yes. I do hear talk of it, but I certainly am not too familiar with the extent of those discussions. There was a target in PDP-7 to have nuclear, or at least looking forward past PDP-7. They had a sort of look ahead section, so they had forecasted in there. As you said, it was removed entirely from PDP-8. There's no reference to nuclear in the plans there, including for the look ahead to 2050 and PDP-8. But yes, you're right. Since then, there have been some discussions that it should come back in and should form some part of the discussion. But I'm not really aware of the details of that.
Okay. I was just curious since it seems like some countries are maybe reconsidering it. Anyway, well, Giles, I appreciate it. I know there's a lot of complexity to these topics, so appreciate your clarity on it. We'll probably try to have you on again at some point as some of these other policies come online and new issues come up. So I appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, it's my great pleasure. Thank you very much. It was great to be here.
That's it for this week's episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. See you next week.